The worst guest we've ever had, because people used to ask me who the worst guest was.
Yes, always.
And I never had an answer, because you don't want to offend anyone.
Yes, of course.
But then I can now say it's Harvey Weinstein, because he was on the show.
Really? And was he a bad guest?
Apparently, yes.
Graham Norton finally confessed at 62.
Wait, really? And he was a bad guest? Apparently so. At 62, Graham Norton finally came clean. After decades of hosting some of the biggest stars in show business, the iconic sharp-witted talk show host has named the 6 celebrities he simply couldn't stand. From behind-the-scenes meltdowns to truly uncomfortable interviews, Norton didn't hold back. And yeah, some of these names will absolutely shock even his most dedicated fans. First on the list, Mark Wahlberg. When it comes to late-night TV, the Graham Norton Show is famous for its lively, fun atmosphere, where celebrity guests share stories over drinks and tons of laughter. But back in 2013, that familiar charm vanished when Mark Wahlberg showed up and delivered one of the most cringe-worthy segments in the show's history, an appearance that is still being talked about and analyzed more than a decade later. The trouble started even before the cameras started rolling. Wahlberg arrived visibly inebriated, his behavior already hinting that the night was going to be unpredictable. While difficult guests are distant, bored, or indifferent, Wahlberg was the exact opposite. Far too eager to take the spotlight, he bulldozed over conversations, made inappropriate jokes, and seemed either unaware or unconcerned about the awkward energy building around him. As the episode went on, the situation only got worse. Wahlberg repeatedly cut off his fellow guests, including comedian Sarah Silverman, with erratic and sometimes crude remarks that left the audience and the other celebrities unsure whether to laugh or cringe. Silverman, a pro at handling awkward comedy, tried to keep a good-natured facade. She smiled and went along with it, but even she couldn't completely hide her discomfort. Wahlberg's behavior crossed a line from playful to completely disruptive, draining the set of its usual smooth rhythm. One of the most bizarre moments happened when Wahlberg physically invaded host Graham Norton's personal space. In what appeared to be a drunken gag, Wahlberg climbed onto Norton's lap, slurring his words as he draped an arm around the clearly uncomfortable host. The audience nervously laughed, unsure if this was a planned bit or an alarming lack of boundaries. Norton, always the consummate professional, tried to keep the mood light and push the show forward, but his body language revealed the truth. He was tense, guarded, and plainly trying to prevent the situation from completely derailing. Norton later spoke about the incident with honesty, saying of Wahlberg, "He was just out of it, really out of it." This summed up the evening perfectly. What should have been a charming, light-hearted episode became a study in celebrity misjudgment, where charisma and too much alcohol collided in front of a live audience. Wahlberg did eventually acknowledge his behavior, although with a sort of casual self-deprecation. "I had a few drinks beforehand. I was enjoying myself too much," he said in a later interview. His tone suggested he didn't view the moment as seriously as others did, brushing it off as a night of harmless overindulgence. But not everyone was so forgiving. While some fans found the whole thing bizarrely entertaining, a peak example of cringe comedy, others saw it as disrespectful, not just to Norton, but to everyone on the couch. This wasn't just a celebrity making a fool of himself. It was a rare moment when the Graham Norton Show, usually kept afloat by its smooth host and relaxed vibe, struggled to stay on course. Norton had to use every trick in his playbook to keep the show moving, shifting topics, deflecting chaos, and trying to give the other guests a chance to participate. The aftermath left a lasting impression. For Norton, Wahlberg's antics weren't just memorable, they were a true test of his ability to manage live chaos. For Wahlberg, it was a reminder that his charm doesn't always land when it's unfiltered, and for viewers, it was an unforgettable episode that blurred the line between funny and uncomfortable, leaving them to wonder, was this hilarious television, or a celebrity spiraling in real time? Either way, it's become a staple of late-night history. It's proof that even the most seasoned hosts can be blindsided by a guest who enjoys the green room bar a little too much. Next, Mickey Rourke. The Graham Norton Show has a well-deserved reputation for transforming stiff celebrity interviews into engaging, lively group conversations. Whether a guest is shy, brash, or unpredictable, Norton almost always finds a way to get a laugh, a story, or at least a smile. But in one painfully unforgettable episode, even Norton's practiced charm couldn't save the vibe because Mickey Rourke simply didn't want to be there. Rourke's appearance was a stark contrast to a chaotic guest like Mark Wahlberg, whose drunken antics at least kept things moving. Rourke, on the other hand, brought the energy to a screeching halt. From the moment he walked on stage, it was clear something was wrong. Dressed in his signature eccentric style, with sunglasses indoors and his small dog Loki cradled in his lap or nearby, Rourke barely interacted with the audience or anyone else on the couch. When Norton started asking questions, he was met with short, mumbled answers and vague stories that left the audience unsure whether to laugh, wait, or cringe. Rourke's responses were so minimal that Norton had to rephrase or repeat his questions just to fill the silence. In one segment, Norton tried to joke about Loki being on the red carpet, to which Rourke replied dryly, "Yes, and I was hoping she took a big piss there, but she didn't." The line got a few laughs, but it was obvious Rourke wasn't joking in a way that invited playful banter. Another guest tried to connect by mentioning her own dog and even offered to show Rourke a photo, hoping to spark some kind of enthusiasm. The interaction completely fell flat. Rourke gave a slight nod, barely engaging. It was as if he was physically present but mentally checked out. Norton, normally skilled at steering the conversation and helping guests relax, was left to do all the heavy lifting. He smiled, tried new approaches, and reached for any hook he could: film roles, awards, personal stories, but Rourke remained completely uninterested. The disconnect was particularly jarring, considering Rourke's colorful history and larger-than-life personality. Viewers expected raw, maybe even chaotic energy, but instead got lethargy. It wasn't just his words, or lack thereof, that made the segment difficult. Rourke's body language told its own story. He leaned far back in his seat, arms folded or loosely gesturing, looking off camera or down at his dog, instead of engaging with the host or his fellow guests. He rarely made eye contact and at times looked as if he were counting the minutes until he could leave. For Norton, the challenge was immense. While he's had his share of stiff guests over the years, Rourke's mix of low energy, cryptic replies, and visible disinterest made this interview stand out as one of the most uncomfortable. The audience could feel the strain as Norton tried to maintain momentum, occasionally turning other guests or completely changing the subject to regain some energy. Unlike a chaotic guest whose unpredictability creates a spectacle, Rourke's lack of participation created a vacuum. It wasn't explosive or controversial, it was just awkward. There was no dramatic meltdown or insult, just a slow, plodding conversation that never got off the ground. The irony is that Rourke is known for being passionate, especially about his dogs. His bond with Loki, whom he once tearfully mentioned in an award speech, is well documented, and Norton clearly hoped this emotional thread might liven up the chat. But even this heartfelt topic didn't break through Rourke's glazed demeanor. His declaration that Loki was the love of my life was touching, but it came in the same deadpan tone as every other comment, making it hard to tell whether he was serious or sarcastic. Next, Kevin Costner. His visit to the Graham Norton Show was far from scandalous. There were no drunken antics, no heated confrontations, and no headline-grabbing moments. Yet, for anyone familiar with the fast-paced, light-hearted rhythm of Norton's show, Costner's appearance was notable for a very different reason. It was while awkward. Norton's talk show thrives on a delicate chemistry between guests, where humor, spontaneity, and shared energy create a relaxed, entertaining atmosphere. But Costner, known for his stoic roles and thoughtful demeanor, seemed like a bad fit for the format. From the beginning, it was clear that his energy didn't quite match the show's comedic and casual tone. While other guests usually come ready to laugh, joke, and tell playful stories, Costner remained serious, earnest, and almost overly grave. One particularly revealing moment came when Norton brought up a behind-the-scenes anecdote from a DVD extra of one of Costner's films, probably Dances with Wolves. Norton tried to find humor in the idea of the Oscar-winning actor having to direct actual wolves on set. There's a thing where you're directing the film, but there's a bit where you're having to direct wolves, Norton prompted, setting up what should have been a funny or at least quirky story. Costner agreed flatly with a simple, "Yeah." Norton kept going, trying again. "And you were having to encourage the wolves to sit." Costner's response, while technically on topic, completely derailed the comedic rhythm. Yeah, well, I tell ya, I remember when we got these wolves, or were our wolves, and I don't know. Here you ever think of salesmen who carpet thing, vacuum cleaner, he said, veering off into a disjointed analogy that lost both the audience and Norton. It wasn't that Costner was being difficult or aloof. He was engaged in his own way, but his long-winded, abstract response lacked a punch and clarity. Instead of a funny story, viewers got a rambling, half-formed comparison to door-to-door salesmen that left the studio audience silent and Norton scrambling for a new angle. Throughout the interview, this pattern repeated. Norton would toss out a lighthearted question or witty remark, and Costner would respond with a literal deadpan answer that completely missed the comedic timing. He wasn't rude, just earnest in a setting that thrives on exaggeration and playfulness. The result was a strange tension between the host and guest. Norton was clearly trying to keep the segment lively, while Costner unintentionally slowed the momentum with each well-meaning but humorless reply. Norton has spoken honestly over the years about guests who don't quite understand the show's format. In one interview, he remarked, "Some people just aren't made for this format. They don't get it, and that's fine. But it makes for a very long show." Watching Costner, it became clear he fit into that category, not because he was unpleasant, but because he approached the chat with the seriousness of a press junket or an awards season interview, not a laid-back British talk show with an audience expecting laughter. The contrast became even more apparent when other guests tried to banter or riff off Costner's comments. Where a different actor might have responded with a joke or added an outrageous twist, Costner often gave quiet, measured replies that brought the humor to a grinding halt. The audience didn't know whether to laugh, listen, or just wait for the next segment. Body language, too, played a role in the awkwardness. Costner sat politely but stiffly, his posture and facial expressions reflecting focus rather than relaxation. He didn't interrupt or take up too much space, but he also never quite meshed with the group dynamic on the couch. Robert De Niro may be a cinematic legend with 2 Academy Awards and a career spanning over 5 decades, but when it comes to interviews, especially the breezy high-energy type favored by the Graham Norton tone, he remains famously difficult to crack. His appearance on the popular British talk show was a masterclass in restraint, bordering on discomfort, and it quickly became one of the most excruciatingly difficult interviews in the show's history. From the moment De Niro took his seat on Norton's iconic red couch, the energy shifted. While fellow guests were chatty, engaged, and visibly relaxed, De Niro appeared almost reluctant to participate. He wasn't openly rude or dismissive, just startlingly quiet. The contrast between his stoic presence and the show's usual freewheeling banter was impossible to ignore. Host Graham Norton, renowned for his ability to get engaging stories from even the most unwilling guests, immediately knew he had a challenge on his hands. De Niro's answers were sparse and hesitant, often no more than a few words or a vague nod. When asked about his legendary career, or behind-the-scenes moments from his iconic films, De Niro responded with a cautious politeness that did little to move the conversation forward. Norton made several brave attempts to get more out of him, referencing funny moments, career milestones, and even trying to find humor in De Niro's well-known reticence. But nothing seemed to work. At one point, after yet another brief, one-sentence reply, Norton finally broke the tension with a quip that perfectly summed up the entire segment. "This is hard work, Robert." The audience laughed, but the message was clear. Getting a lively interview from De Niro was like pulling teeth. To be fair, De Niro has long had a reputation for being difficult to interview. He is famously guarded, uncomfortable with public self-reflection, and not particularly fond of the talk show format. In many appearances across various programs, he's shown a preference for avoiding personal stories, sticking to brief, often cryptic responses, and leaning into his naturally quiet demeanor. But the Graham Norton Show, built on rapid-fire anecdotes and shared laughter, left little room for that kind of quiet intensity. The awkwardness was magnified by the setting. Unlike American late-night shows where guests come out one by one for individual chats, the Graham Norton Show features all the guests on the couch at the same time, encouraging spontaneous group interaction. De Niro's disengagement stood in stark contrast to his fellow guests, who laughed, joked, and played off Norton's prompts with enthusiasm. De Niro, by comparison, often sat quietly, looking down or straight ahead, rarely making eye contact, and offering no follow-ups to anyone else's stories. There was also the matter of his body language. De Niro's posture was stiff, his expressions mostly blank or faintly uncomfortable. He didn't lean into conversations or react visibly to jokes. It was as though he was doing everything he could to be anywhere else. While Norton kept the show moving with his typical charm and wit, there was no disguising the effort it took to keep the momentum alive. For Norton, the experience was clearly frustrating. Even if he hated it, after years of hosting, he's had to navigate all kinds of personalities, from chaotic party guests to painfully shy actors. But De Niro's mix of iconic status and emotional distance made this encounter particularly challenging. The host later admitted in an interview that, while he doesn't expect every guest to be a comedian or extrovert, some just don't get the format, and that makes for a very long show. Now, Harvey Weinstein, before his name became synonymous with scandal, disgrace, and the collapse of Hollywood's power structure, Harvey Weinstein was still a towering figure in the entertainment industry, a mogul whose presence could command a room. But even then, long before the public knew the full extent of his crimes, there were moments when his abrasive personality and overbearing nature were impossible to overlook. One of those moments came during his uncomfortable, now infamous appearance on The Graham Norton Show. Weinstein wasn't a typical guest. Unlike the actors, musicians, or comedians who filled Norton's couch with energy, charm, and humor, Weinstein arrived as a producer, someone not usually in front of the camera. His reputation for controlling conversations and dominating creative decisions had long been known in Hollywood, and on that night his reputation was on full display. From the outset, Weinstein's presence felt wrong. While the format of The Graham Norton Show relies on shared conversation, spontaneous banter, and a generous give and take between guests, Weinstein seemed determined to make the evening all about himself. He cut off fellow guests, interrupted Norton mid-question, and constantly steered the conversation toward his own body of work, as if eager to remind everyone of the power and influence he possessed. Norton, a master at keeping difficult interviews on track with humor and charm, appeared visibly strained. He smiled tightly, pivoted quickly, and tried to redirect Weinstein when the producer went on long, self-aggrandizing tangents. But it was clear from Norton's body language that he was walking on eggshells, trying to avoid a direct confrontation while still keeping the show afloat. Rather than play along with the show's usual wit and playfulness, Weinstein adopted a tone that felt more like a press conference than a lighthearted chat. He talked at length about films he'd produced, awards he'd won, and stars he had discovered, often referencing people and projects in a way that suggested ownership rather than admiration. His confidence veered into arrogance, and his tone toward both Norton and the other guests had a condescending air. There were moments when the discomfort became palpable. Weinstein, not known for comedic timing, failed to pick up on jokes and instead answered lighthearted questions with long, self-congratulatory replies. The audience, usually quick to laugh and cheer, offered only awkward chuckles or silence. Fellow guests tried to participate, but the dynamic had shifted. Weinstein had taken over the room, and no one seemed quite sure how to respond. In hindsight, the signs were all there. Norton himself has since commented on the interaction, admitting that even in the moment, something felt off. "I had no idea at the time," he said years later, after the Weinstein scandal erupted and the producer was publicly exposed for decades of sexual misconduct. "But looking back, you do think, oh, that makes sense." Weinstein's appearance didn't explode into controversy at the time, but its legacy aged poorly. After his fall from grace, clips from the episode resurfaced, with many viewers rewatching the segment through a new, darker lens. Suddenly, the controlling interruptions, the smug arrogance, the subtle dismissal of others on the couch, they weren't just awkward talk show moments. They were signs of a man used to dominating every space he entered. For Norton, who has hosted thousands of celebrities over the years, from shy actors to over-the-top comedians, this interview stands as one of the most draining and unpleasant, not because it was wild or chaotic, but because of the slow, uncomfortable realization that something about Weinstein's presence was inherently wrong. In the years since, The Graham Norton Show has continued to thrive, and Norton himself remains one of the most beloved talk show hosts in the world. But among the many faces who've sat on that red couch, Harvey Weinstein remains one of the few Norton would likely prefer to erase from the show's history. It's an unsettling reminder that sometimes the most dangerous people aren't the loudest or wildest, but those who believe themselves untouchable. Finally, Daryl Hannah. Over the years, The Graham Norton Show has featured a dazzling array of stars, some charming, some chaotic, and others completely off the rails. Host Graham Norton, with his razor-sharp wit and calm command of the room, has navigated almost every kind of celebrity personality, but when asked to name his worst guest of all time, he doesn't hesitate. It wasn't a drunken guest, a diva, or even someone explosive. It was Daryl Hannah. The experience left such a lasting impression that Norton has publicly called it excruciating. While he has managed unruly, arrogant, or overly serious stars with a mix of humor and redirection, Hannah's complete unwillingness to engage made her appearance uniquely painful. Her demeanor wasn't hostile or confrontational. It was vacant. From the moment she took her seat on the iconic red couch, it became painfully obvious that something was wrong. While most guests at least pretend to enjoy themselves for the sake of the audience, Hannah seemed determined to avoid any interaction whatsoever. Norton, usually able to draw out even the most reticent guests, was left scrambling. Her answers were painfully brief. One word, maybe two if he was lucky. There were long, awkward silences that followed even the simplest questions. When asked about her career, her projects, or even humorous hypotheticals, Hannah offered nothing. She didn't deflect with jokes, nor did she lean into introspection. She simply sat there. In a later interview, Norton recalled the experience with brutal honesty. She just sat there saying nothing. It was like she had been dragged there against her will. Unlike someone like Robert De Niro, whose quiet presence still allowed space for others to talk and for Norton to steer the conversation, Hannah's silence was stifling. There was no spark, no rhythm, just dead air. The worst part, as Norton described, was that there was nowhere to go. With other difficult guests, he could change the subject, toss a joke, or pivot to the group for help, but Hannah gave him nothing to work with. Her refusal to engage wasn't just a lack of enthusiasm, it actively shut down the flow of the show. Even the audience grew noticeably uncomfortable, unsure whether they were watching an actual interview or a slow public unraveling of a talk show segment. What made it even more bewildering was that Hannah wasn't there promoting anything particularly controversial or weighty. It should have been a straightforward chat about her acting roles and upcoming projects. Instead, it became an exercise in endurance for Norton, who had to carry the weight of the entire segment with no support from his guest. Unlike some celebrities who warm up once they settle in, Hannah never changed. Her energy remained flat, her tone expressionless, and her interest, if it ever existed, vanished entirely by the halfway point. Norton was forced to pivot the conversation away from her completely just to salvage the flow of the show. For a host known for making even the dullest stories feel lively, this was the rare moment where all his usual tools, charm, timing, humor, were rendered useless. And while the episode may have faded into obscurity in the broader run of the Graham Norton Show, it left a deep mark on Norton himself. To this day, when interviewers or fans ask him about the thus difficult guest he's ever faced, Norton doesn't hesitate. It wasn't the controlling producers, the intoxicated actors, or the shy introverts. It was Daryl Hannah, the guest who, for reasons still unclear, decided not to show up in any meaningful way at all. In the vast history of Norton's career, filled with unpredictable characters and unforgettable moments, Daryl Hannah's cold silence remains the one appearance he'd likely erase if he could, not because it was scandalous, but because it was the one time even he, the king of talk show improvisation, had no way forward. What do you think about the 6 famous guests that Graham Norton hates the most? Leave us your comments in the section below. We hope you have found this helpful video. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy this content. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next videos. Goodbye.